Neutral signal. The night still held not because of darkness, but out of habit. The only light in the room came from the monitor, too white to feel warm. Neon from across the street flickered on the window glass, letters moving, offering nothing. A cup sat on the desk, the coffee long cold. She logged into the system and put on her headset. One earphone didn't sit right, so she adjusted it. The signal arrived without sound, just a small indicator on the screen. She waited. The first call ended quickly. The second was the same. She answered with the same sentences, slowly, without urgency. Between the calls there were gaps short, but long enough. The monitor warmed softly. She sat still and waited for the next signal. Voices arrived already tired. She answered them the same way each time, letting the words fall where they always fell. The screen refreshed. Numbers changed. Between two calls, there was a pause, longer than the others. She didn't move, waiting. The headset pressed lightly against her ears. A faint hum from the computer filled the room. She watched the indicator. It blinked. She spoke again, slower now, careful not to add anything. When the line went dead, she kept listening for a second longer than necessary. Then another call came in, and another. The rhythm returned. The call came without warning. No difference in the signal. She answered the way she always did. His voice arrived clean, without strain, as if it hadn't traveled far. He didn't ask how she was. He spoke slowly, leaving space between his sentences not for her, but for himself. She listened, her hand resting near the keyboard. When the line went silent, she didn't end it right away. She waited, long enough for the silence to feel deliberate. Then it broke. He was still there. She said one sentence shorter than usual and stopped. The call ended on his side. The screen returned to its neutral glow. She remained where she was, listening to the empty headset. He called again, not the next night, not after a long absence, just often enough that she began to notice the space where his call might arrive. She didn't change how she worked. The same posture, the same tone. Before his call, others came through. She answered them without listening closely. Their words passed and fell away. The gaps between calls felt different now. She kept her eyes on the indicator, longer than necessary. When his voice returned, she waited too long before answering. He spoke, nothing important. Still, she listened as if the sound itself mattered. After the line went quiet, she stayed connected for a moment too long. Then she ended the call. The connection faltered midway through the next call. A brief crackle, and a thinning of his voice, as if it were moving farther away. She didn't interrupt. Her hand lifted slightly from the desk and stopped there. There was a pause, not a clean break, not silence. She adjusted the headset, pressing one earphone closer. His voice returned, uneven, but still his. He finished the sentence he had started. She answered, though the moment had already passed. When the call ended, she stayed connected. The signal cleared. The system moved on. Other calls filled the hours. She moved through them without settling. Some lines stayed open longer than necessary. One ended too soon. The screen logged each one and forgot them immediately. When his call came again, she noticed how little time had passed since the last. She let it ring for a moment before answering. He spoke. She listened. Afterward, she didn't look at the next incoming signal right away. She reached for the coffee, stopped, her hand resting near the cup without touching it. The line connected. She spoke automatically. He spoke about movement, not plans, not destinations, just roads, the way they opened and closed again. He mentioned towns by name, passed through them without stopping. His voice stayed even. When he paused, she waited. The silence stretched. She answered with a short response, careful not to shape it into a question. He continued briefly, then stopped. The call ended. She remained seated, listening to the headset after it had gone empty. The signal did not come when it usually did. She kept the headset on. Other calls arrived and passed. She answered them without delay. Between one call and the next, there was a longer gap. She watched the screen without blinking. Outside, the neon kept working. She stayed logged in until the end of the shift. When the system signed her out, she didn't remove the headset right away. The silence pressed closer. Nothing followed it. She logged in again the next night at the same hour. The screen brightened. The system loaded. Everything in its place. She put on the headset more slowly this time. Calls came. She answered them. Between two connections, she glanced at the indicator, then looked away. It didn't change. The voice was unfamiliar lower, hurried. She answered without adjusting her tone. The line stayed open longer than expected. He talked. She listened. Her attention slipped. She watched the timer advance. The headset pressed harder than before. When the call ended, she didn't register how. The next signal arrived almost immediately. She answered it the same way. Morning came without ceremony. The screen was still lit. The neon thinned and disappeared from the glass. The room felt larger. She reached up and removed the headset, set it down beside the keyboard. The plastic was warm. She logged out, closed the system window. For a moment, the monitor stayed bright. She turned it off. The room did not answer. Outside, the day continued. She didn't follow it. The note has been open on my phone for 3,189 days. An active draft, a constant. It's the first thing I see in the morning. The blue light, a familiar ghost in the dark. My thumb hovering over the screen before the alarm even thinks about going off. It's a ritual, I suppose. The same way, I pour exactly 1.5 cups of water into the coffee maker. The way I count the seconds for the kettle to boil. The way my feet find the same cold spots on the floor. Everything is a system, a set of instructions I follow to get from sunrise to sunset. A code to keep the world from fraying at the edges. It's funny how we build these little fortresses in our own minds, isn't it? Walls made of routine. Each step, from the bedroom to the kitchen, is measured, precise, predictable. It has to be. Because outside these walls, the world is anything but. Walking to the station, the city is a blur of predictable chaos. People rushing, cars honking, the same smell of exhaust and street food. But my focus is narrow. It's on the third paving stone from the corner of Elm and 7th. There's a crack in it, shaped a bit like a lightning bolt if you squint. I always step over it, never on it. It's another rule. I remember when the rule was made. I was younger, walking a few steps behind him. He was always ahead, a fast walker, his long legs eating up the sidewalk. He stepped right on that crack, and I remember thinking just for a second that the world would split open. He didn't even notice. He just kept walking, pulling further and further away, even when we were still together. These little flashes, they come back uninvited, softer, dreamier. Him, always facing forward, his back a permanent fixture in my memory. Active draft. He never looked back, not once. I used to wonder what he saw up ahead. It was so much more interesting than what was behind him. Now I think maybe he wasn't looking at anything at all. Maybe he was just moving, because standing still was too hard. I get that now. The office is quiet today, a kind of quiet that hums with unspoken deadlines and the low thrum of servers. I sit down, the warm fabric of my chair sighing under my weight. Another system, another set of predictable motions. Log in, open email, open the project tracker. It's a shared file, a digital ledger of our team's life for the past decade. Names, projects, dates, a history. And there it is, his name. It's been there for years, an archived entry, a ghost in the machine, just like the note on my phone. We built this document together, line by line, cell by cell. It was our blueprint for the future, His name is next to projects we launched, ideas we celebrated, failures we learned from. It's a hyperlink to a past I've kept meticulously preserved. My cursor blinks, a steady, rhythmic pulse. It's been blinking over his name for years. But today, the rhythm feels different. It feels like a countdown. My hand is steady. I click, I drag, I highlight the entire row. The letters of his name glow, selected, waiting for a command. For so long, I thought deleting it would be like tearing a page out of my own story, that it would leave a hole, a jagged, empty space. But looking at it now, highlighted in that sterile blue, it doesn't feel like a part of me. It feels like a footnote, a reference to a chapter that's long since ended. My finger finds the delete key. I press it. There's no sound, no explosion, just a quiet digital ripple. The row vanishes. The spreadsheet recalibrates, the lines below shifting upward to close the gap. It's seamless. The alignment tightens. There is no hole, no empty space. The document is just shorter, more concise, whole. Evening settles in. The sun bleeds out of the sky, leaving bruises of purple and orange. Back in my apartment, the air is still. I pick up my phone. The screen glows. The active draft is still there, waiting. 3,189 days of a story I kept telling myself. A story about waiting for someone to turn around. A story about a crack in the pavement. I read it one last time. Then, my thumb moves with a new kind of purpose. It doesn't hover. It taps. Delete note. A small confirmation box appears, asking if I'm sure. Am I sure? For the first time in a very long time, I am. I tap yes, and just like that, it's gone. An empty screen looks back at me. I set the phone down on the table, face up. I don't need to hide the screen anymore. I just sit there, in the quiet, watching the shadows from the window stretch across the floor. They grow longer and longer, swallowing the last of the light until the room is perfectly, peacefully still. And in that stillness, I can finally breathe. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more. Before the first light, the building was awake, only in the way machines are awake. Lights burned through whole floors without touching anything human. The glass held the night at a careful distance, turning the city into a quiet reflection that did not ask to be entered. Somewhere above, air moved through vents. The lobby smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Nothing had been left behind. He sat at the security desk with his jacket unbuttoned, hands resting where they could be seen. The monitor showed doors that never opened and corridors that never changed. A paper cup stood beside him. The coffee was already losing heat. He did not drink it. He watched the seconds pass on a digital clock that made no sound. From time to time he looked up, as if expecting something. The building did not respond. On the desk lay a stack of invoice forms, the company name printed too large at the top. He picked one up and turned it over. He held it longer than necessary before setting it down again. Outside, a truck passed on the distant highway, its noise softened by glass and height. When the sound was gone, the silence returned, heavier than before. He began the rounds at the same minute every night. The doors accepted his key without resistance. The corridors returned his footsteps evenly. On the 20th floor, one light flickered and steadied again. He stopped there, not because of the light. He stayed long enough to notice his breathing, then moved on. Nothing followed him. Back at the desk, the coffee had gone flat and lukewarm. He drank it without hurry. An invoice lay open in front of him, its lines clean and empty. He wrote a few words along the margin, small enough to stay out of the way. When he finished, he tore the page off, folded it once, then unfolded it again. It did not improve. An hour later, he made the round again. Not all of it. The doors accepted him. The floors passed in their usual order. He checked his watch and found he had not been mistaken. The second page lay beside the first now. He did not stack them. He left them where they were, as if spacing mattered. Toward the middle of the night, he noticed that the stack had thinned. Not by much. Enough to hesitate. He counted the remaining forms once, then stopped before he reached the end. He slid the papers into a neater line and left them there. On the next round, he skipped a floor. Not deliberately. His feet carried him past the stairwell and only corrected themselves later. He stood for a moment with the radio in his hand, listening to the low hiss between channels. No one called in. He did not report anything. When he returned to the desk, the clock showed the same hour as before, only further along. He sat down and rested his palms on the surface, feeling the faint vibration from the building. It was steady. He picked up a blank form and held it without writing, longer than he meant to. Then he put it back. Sometime before morning, he left the elevator on the wrong floor. The doors closed behind him without complaint. The hallway lights were dimmer here, set lower. He reached into his pocket and found a folded sheet he did not remember putting there. He smoothed it once and let it rest on the small shelf beside the elevator buttons. On the way back down, he did not look at it. The car moved slowly, stopping where it always stopped. At the desk, the radio crackled once and fell silent again. He signed the log with the same careful letters he had used for years. When the first light touched the glass, it did not reach him. The building began to change shifts. He stood, straightened his jacket, and waited. The sky lightened without color, a pale adjustment behind the glass. Desks and chairs took shape again, as if they had been there all along. He poured out the last of the coffee and rinsed the cup, leaving it upside down to dry. The desk looked larger once the papers were gone. He picked up a single blank form from the drawer and held it for a moment. The paper was stiff, unused. He folded it once, carefully, and slid it into his coat pocket. It did not matter there. Still, he felt it settle. When he stepped outside, the air was cooler than he expected. Cars moved along the street with early purpose. He did not hurry. Behind him, the building kept its lights on. He walked until the noise took over, and the night let him go. Compliance. The room is 6 steps long if I count heel to toe, and 4 steps wide if I don't rush. The door opens inward and stops at my knee. I keep it there because if it opens fully, it presses the cable tray, and the tray hums louder. I don't like the louder sound. The air is set to 19. I can tell because the panel says 19, and because my hands stay stiff until the 3rd minute. Time doesn't come in minutes here. It comes in the time it takes the fans to spin up and then settle, and sometimes those 2 intervals feel the same. I agreed once, which is what they keep reminding me, though the reminders arrive as emails with polite subject lines that look like errands. I remember the screen, the scroll bar, already near the bottom, the checkbox with the thin border. I remember how my finger hovered and how the cursor blinked as if it had somewhere else to be. I remember thinking I was late, and that thought felt reasonable. I clicked. That was all. No flourish. No witness. The system accepted it with a soft chime that sounded like a notification from another room. Now I am here because the agreement says I will be here. It says so in words that flatten into procedure when I read them. I have read them enough times that they feel like notes I took myself. The words are calm. They tell me to avoid disruption. They list reasons. The reasons feel like avoidance when I look back, but at the time, they felt like the only path that didn't branch. The racks fill the room and also define it. If I lean too far between rack B and C, my badge lanyard brushes the vent, and I notice. I notice everything because there isn't space not to. The floor tiles are numbered on a map I keep folded in my pocket, even though I don't need it anymore. I unfold it sometimes just to refold it, because the creases remind me of order. The hum compresses moments together. The past hour and the next hour share the same pitch. They spoke to me earlier through the intercom. I didn't hear words so much as cadence, pauses where agreement was expected. I supplied those pauses. When I spoke back, my voice sounded thinner than it does in the corridor, and I chose words that sounded like reasons: capacity planning, stability, compliance. I heard myself and thought it sounded like someone else summarizing me. I didn't correct anything. Correction takes time, and time is already full. On the console, the maintenance window counts down from 0 even when it isn't running. That's a quirk I never reported because it never caused an incident. The checkbox is there again. Different box, different screen. It asks me to confirm irreversible changes. The word irreversible is printed in the same font as the rest, so it doesn't stand out unless I let it. I let it stand out just enough to feel thorough. The reason is that the secondary firmware is deprecated. The reason is that keeping it costs more power than the primary. The reason is that nobody uses it anymore. All of these reasons arrive at once and stack neatly. I pull the secondary drive sled halfway out and push it back in. That isn't required, but it grounds me. The system doesn't care about grounding. The agreement doesn't either. I check the serial number against the list taped inside the door. The tape has yellowed. I think about replacing it, then think about the adhesive residue and decide against it. Avoidance can wear a uniform of care. The action itself takes less time than the thought. I type the command I have typed before in testing environments where nothing mattered. Here it matters in a way that feels smaller than it should. The console responds with a progress bar that jumps ahead in uneven increments. I watch it without leaning closer. At 40%, the fans change pitch. At 60, the lights flicker once, not enough to trip anything. At 99, the bar pauses. It always pauses. The pause feels like an hour folded into a second. Then it completes, and the confirmation text appears. The secondary firmware is overwritten. There is no backup. The system writes the change to a place that is not meant to be written again. This is the irreversible minor action I am allowed to take. It does not resolve anything. It removes an option that was theoretical anyway. The agreement did not require me to remove it today. The reasons suggested today. I followed the reasons because they fit. I note the time. The clock on my wrist says something different from the clock on the console, and I choose the console. The room does not care which I choose. The room stays the same size. The hum stays within the same narrow band. My hands are still stiff. I think of the intercom cadence again and how my pauses matched theirs. I think of how agreeing once felt like saving time. The corridor outside is brighter, but I don't open the door all the way. I log the change in the system that tracks changes. The form has fields that remember me. My name appears without my typing it. The reason field accepts my reasons without comment. The submit button depresses and returns. Somewhere else, a light changes color for a moment and then goes back. That is also an external system, and it has been altered in a way that will not be undone. There is a checklist clipped to the rack. I initial the line about verifying airflow, even though I did not touch the vents. The initial looks like it did yesterday. I straighten the pen so it points the same way it always does. I pull the door toward me until it stops at my knee. I scan my badge on the reader to log my presence, and the reader beeps. I scan it again because the procedure says to confirm. I scan it again because the reader sometimes misses. I scan it again as the hum continues and the checklist stays clipped, and I write the time in the log and close it and set it back and reach for the pen to initial the next line as the routine goes on. The log accepts my initials. The ink dries slower today, or I notice it more. I wipe the pen tip on the margin where no one looks. The margin keeps accumulating small marks that mean nothing and will never be cleaned. The room hasn't changed size, but it feels like it has because the fans are in a different phase, and phases trick me into thinking there's progress. I hear the intercom click again. The click arrives before the voice, which gives me time to prepare an answer that sounds like listening. The voice comes through flattened, as if it has passed through several versions of itself. It asks if I'm comfortable proceeding. Comfortable is not the word I would choose, but I nod because nodding keeps the cadence moving. I say yes because yes is short and doesn't require explanation. I say yes because I said yes once before, and this feels like the echo of that. They mention the exception clause. I remember the clause because I read it twice when I first agreed. It allows for delays under specific conditions. Those conditions are listed in a way that suggests they exist, but are rare. I consider invoking them. I can almost feel the shape of the sentence I would need. It would be long. It would include dates. It would invite a reply. I don't like inviting replies. I say there are no exceptions today. The voice pauses in the place where gratitude would fit. I supply silence. Time compresses again. The last week and the next hour share the same texture. I move between racks because movement keeps my joints from locking. Rack D has a sticker peeling at the corner. I press it flat even though it will peel again. Pressing it changes nothing and feels like maintenance, which is acceptable. On the console, a new notification appears. It is labeled optional. Optional means it will keep appearing until I acknowledge it. It refers to the redundancy map, which I updated months ago but never finalized. Finalizing will remove the temporary routes that were meant for testing. The reasons present themselves. Temporary routes complicate audits. Temporary routes confuse new staff. Temporary routes draw questions. Questions stretch time. I tell myself I'll just look. Looking becomes clicking. Clicking becomes a sequence. The sequence is familiar because familiarity reduces friction. The system warns me again about permanence. The warning uses the same font as everything else. I read it. I read it again because reading twice feels responsible. I think about the clause. I think about the corridor light changing color somewhere else. I think about how the agreement phrases responsibility as continuity. I confirm. The redundancy map locks. The temporary routes disappear from the diagram and from the underlying tables. The system writes to a ledger that cannot be rolled back without physical intervention. That intervention would require a request. Requests require replies. I watch the diagram settle into fewer lines. The lines look cleaner. Clean is a dangerous word, but I don't say it out loud. I log the change. The form remembers me again. It remembers my reasons too, offering them as suggestions. I accept the suggestions because they are accurate enough. The submit button behaves as expected. Somewhere, another light changes and returns. I imagine someone noticing the brief change and deciding it was nothing. That imagination comforts me because it implies distance. My badge vibrates with a reminder I set for myself weeks ago. It says hydrate. I take a sip from the bottle on the shelf. The bottle has a crack near the base that doesn't leak yet. I should replace it, but replacing it would mean walking farther than 6 steps. I set it back. The room's limit presses in. I count the steps again, heel to toe, slower this time. 6, 4. The door stays at my knee. The cable tray hums at its chosen volume. I initial another line on the checklist. The line is about verifying backups. The backups exist except for the parts one removed. The checklist doesn't ask for details. The intercom clicks, but no voice follows. I wait through the expected cadence and then a little longer. Nothing arrives. I decide the click was a test or a mistake. Mistakes happen elsewhere. Here we have procedures. I open the folded map and refold it along the same creases. The creases have memorized my hands. I place the map back in my pocket, oriented the same way it always is. Orientation matters in small rooms. A warning icon flashes briefly on the console and disappears. I don't chase it. Chasing creates logs. Logs create reviews. Reviews create meetings. Meetings compress time in ways I don't control. I prefer the compression that happens on its own. I scan my badge to log my presence again, because the procedure allows multiple scans, and redundancy is a kind of safety. The reader beeps. The beep sounds identical to the last one. I write the time in the log using the console's clock and not my wrist. I close the log. I set it back. I straighten the pen. I initial the next line. I initial it again because the ink skipped the first time. I initial it again to be sure. I reach for the bottle. I set it down. I scan my badge. I initial the line. I initial the line. I initial the line as the routine continues unchanged. Foreign shoes on asphalt. Morning came without ceremony. The sky over the town was low and colorless, pressed down as if it had been there all night. The asphalt along Main Street was still wet from a rain that no one remembered hearing. It reflected the light from a flickering diner sign across the road. The letter R blinked slower than the others, lagging behind, like it was already tired. He stood near the curb and looked down at his shoes. They were brown once. Now they were the color of dried mud. The leather had softened unevenly, bent by years of walking that had never been meant for this place. The soles were thick, too thick. They belonged to colder streets, to winters that lasted. Here, people wore lighter shoes, shoes that moved quickly. He crossed the street carefully. The asphalt was uneven near the storm drain. He knew the spot. His foot caught there every morning, not enough to stumble, just enough to remind him. He adjusted his pace without thinking. His body had learned before he had. It had learned it years ago, in other towns that no longer needed him either. Inside the diner, the air smelled of old coffee and cleaning spray. The windows were fogged, though no one was inside except him and the woman behind the counter. She poured coffee without asking. The mug was chipped at the rim. He wrapped his hands around it and waited for the warmth to come. It didn't. He lit a cigarette at the small table near the window. Outside, a pickup truck passed, then another. The town was waking up in parts. The coffee cooled quickly. He drank it anyway. He always did. He watched people walk past the diner window and noticed their feet first. Sneakers, clean boots, soft soles. None of them hesitated at the curb. When he finished the cigarette, he left a few bills on the table and went back outside. The rain had stopped completely now. The asphalt was beginning to dry in narrow lines where the wind reached it. He walked toward the warehouse at the edge of town, counting the cracks. At the same place near the storm drain, his shoe caught again. This time he stopped. He looked down at the worn edge of the sole. Water seeped through when it rained. He felt it earlier, cold against his sock. He knew it would happen again. The warehouse windows were dark. A note was taped to the door. He didn't read it closely. He didn't need to. These things changed often here. Schedules, shifts, rules, always rewritten before they had settled. He turned away and walked to the discount store 2 blocks down. Inside, the lights were too bright. He stood in the aisle for a long time, holding a box with new shoes inside. They were lighter, cheaper, made for this town maybe. At the register, he paid without checking the price. Outside, he sat on a low concrete wall and changed them. The new shoes felt strange, too thin, like the last pair he had bought before this one. The ground pressed back immediately. He stood up and took a few steps. They moved faster than he did. He carried the old shoes in the box. The sky opened briefly as he walked back toward Main Street. A thin band of sunlight touched the asphalt and moved slowly across it. The wet surface dried where the light passed. He stopped under the diner's metal awning and watched it happen. For a moment, he didn't think about where he was going next. He had stopped like this before, in other towns, under other awnings. He didn't smoke. He didn't check the time. The town continued around him, unchanged. A motel clean enough. The diner stood by the highway like something that had been left there too long. Outside, a fine rain was falling, quietly, as if it didn't want to draw attention to itself. The windows were slightly greasy from old fingerprints. Through them, the gray asphalt and a few parked trucks could be seen. The man sat by the window with his back to the room. A cup of coffee stood in front of him. The steam was gone, so was the taste. He rested his hands on the table. They were rough, crossed with small scars that explained nothing. The woman sat at the counter. She had taken off her coat, but hadn't hung it up. It lay folded across her knees. The waitress wiped the counter, then wiped it again for no reason. A radio murmured about the weather somewhere else. The woman lifted her cup, took a sip, and set it down. The coffee was too hot. Then it wasn't. She glanced at the man. There was nothing else to look at. He raised his eyes at the same moment. They both noticed it. The rain grew heavier and began to tap against the tin roof. The sound filled the space between the tables. The man lit a cigarette, even though a sign hung on the wall. The smoke rose slowly and did not disappear right away. The woman shifted on her stool so she could see the window. Nothing moved in the diner. It felt as though the evening had stalled there. The waitress brought more coffee without being asked. She set the cups down gently, as if noise might disturb something fragile. The man nodded once. The woman wrapped her hands around the mug, but didn't drink. Outside, a truck engine started and then stopped again. Someone must have changed their mind. The man stirred his coffee, even though there was nothing in it. The spoon clicked against the porcelain and then lay still. He watched the surface darken as it cooled. The woman traced a line on the counter with her finger where the wood had been worn smooth. She asked him if the rain had been like this all day. He said it had. They didn't add anything. A silence settled that didn't feel awkward. It simply stayed. The radio went quiet between stations, then came back faintly. The waitress leaned against the register and looked past them, as if she were waiting for someone who wasn't coming. The man crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and left it there longer than necessary. The woman stood up first. She put on her coat slowly, button by button. The man reached for his wallet, then paused. He looked at her and said there was a motel down the road. It was clean enough. She nodded, as if he had only pointed out the direction of the highway. They left the coffee on the table, untouched, growing cold in the dim light. The motel sign flickered once before settling into a dull, steady glow. The rain had thinned to a mist that clung to their coats. They walked a few steps apart, not out of caution, but habit. Gravel shifted under their shoes. Somewhere a door slammed, then the sound was gone. The man unlocked the room and held the door until she passed. The smell inside was of detergent and something older that never quite left. The room was plain. A bed, a small table, a lamp with a shade turned slightly crooked. The curtains did not close all the way. Light from the parking lot lay across the floor in a narrow strip. The woman set her bag down near the chair and stood there, as if waiting for the room to speak first. The man placed his keys on the table. He noticed how loud they sounded and did not move them again. They sat on the edge of the bed without touching. Outside, a car passed, and the headlights slid briefly along the wall. The woman said it would be morning soon. He said nothing. It was not a question. They stayed like that for a while, listening to the quiet return after the sound had gone, both of them aware that nothing needed to be decided. The light was turned off before the room was fully dark. For a moment, the outlines remained: the bed, the table, the narrow strip of brightness from the parking lot. The man lay back and stared at the ceiling he could no longer see. The woman shifted beside him, careful not to brush his arm. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked once. Later, they were close without urgency. It was quiet and unremarkable, like something both of them had done before and did not need to name. The lamp stayed off. The sounds they made were small and quickly faded. When it was over, nothing in the room looked different. The rain had stopped. The air felt thinner. They lay awake longer than expected. The man reached for his watch on the table and stopped halfway. The woman turned on her side, facing the window. The light outside had dulled. Neither spoke. The room held them without comment, and eventually their breathing slowed. Not together, but not entirely apart either. Morning came without sound. The light slipped in through the gap in the curtains and rested on the wall, pale and uncertain. For a moment it looked warm, almost kind, and then it thinned and lost its color. The man was awake first. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled on his shirt. The fabric felt cooler than he expected. His watch lay where he had left it. He put it on without checking the time. The woman woke while he was tying his shoes. She sat up slowly, as if her body needed to agree to it. Her hair was flattened on one side. She reached for her coat and held it for a second before putting it on. They looked at each other briefly. There was nothing in their faces that needed to be answered. Outside, the pavement was drying in uneven patches. A truck passed on the highway and did not slow down. The woman walked toward the road without turning back. The man stood by the door until she was no longer visible, then closed it and locked it once. The room returned to its quiet. The day moved on.